So in Christian music, there were a lot of different charts out there. So there was the inspo chart, which was kind of that soft, um, Christian music that was that grandma would love to listen to.
Hmm.
Then there was contemporary or adult AC, right, which was more of the main pop, right down the line. Then there was alternative or Christian rock, CCR, that was, I mean, maybe for him jumped up on that chart
Hmm.
every now and then. But really, what For Him did and what bands like the 77's didn't really cross paths a lot. We didn't play at the same time in festivals, same stages. It was like two different worlds within one world. And so I'm really excited to meet you today, Michael, and to talk about your career and kind of get to know you after, uh, just really going back and listening to your music again and discovering it all over again. I'm excited to have this conversation because I want to know your life in CCM. And so, welcome to the One Degree of Andy podcast, Michael Roe of the 77's. Man, it's good to connect with you.
Yeah, it's great. I heard Brent Bourgeois' interview, and I thought, well, I want to be on that. I felt like with the roster of people that you've had so far, you might need a sort of renegade village idiot type, character to come in and offset some of that.
Well, I gotta say, man, just going back and listening to the 77's over the last couple of weeks, I've enjoyed everything you guys have done. Even going back and watching, reminding myself of the music videos that you made.
Hmm.
I mean, Mercy Mercy just blew my mind. I'd kind of forgotten about that song and just what guts it took to be yourselves in that environment and to preach the gospel in your own way. And just, I don't know, I have such respect for you guys. 'Cause here, one of the things that, not to disparage anybody else and For Him, but I was always the one going, can we do something different? I mean, could we like maybe try and go edgier, a little more alternative? Because our voices are going to bring it back towards the center. But I'm like,
Right.
I would love to stretch out a little bit more. And we never really did. And I'm not
Hmm.
sure our audience would have, followed us there. But man, I always just with a little bit of, you know, I don't know if it was jealousy looking at what you guys were able to accomplish and some of the music guys were able to to produce and put together. Man, I
Hmm.
just I just love what I've been listening to over the last couple of weeks.
Well, that's really a great thing to hear because I didn't know what you would think of our music. And I've enjoyed listening to your music, conversely, because it kind of tells a story to me of how my career in Christian music would have gone had God not pushed me towards this other avenue left of center.
Yeah.
Because in the 70s, before I got involved in 77s, I was doing very pop music. I had this little trio with these guys that sang like you guys did. And we were playing in all kinds of pubs and pizza parlors and doing tight three-part harmony. We do stuff like Simon and Garfunkel and the Beatles and Cat Stevens, James Taylor, all that stuff. And I was really getting into that. I was excited. I was writing songs with these guys, and the songs were a lot closer to what you guys ended up doing
Huh.
than what the 77s did. And we were about to get some really great opportunities in that band. But right in the middle of that, God sort of entered into my life because I'd sort of slid off the path. I was raised in church, in an evangelical church. My dad was totally into gospel music, specifically Southern white gospel quartets and all of that,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Statesman, Blackwood Brothers. And when I was 15, I was asked to join a group that had formed in this place called Bethany Bible College, which was an
Yeah.
Assemblies of God
Hmm.
college up in the Santa Cruz area.
Yep.
And these guys were all older than me. Some of them you might know the names of, like Roger Flessing, who ended up at working for Jim and Tammy Baker. A lot of these guys ended up working for the Bakers, actually.
Wow.
But they formed this big group, in 1969, and it was patterned after Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Chicago, that kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
I was 15 years old and really rocking, you know, and I was the best guitar player they could find, so I schlepped myself in there, and we ended up doing things like opening for Andre Crouch and the Disciples back when they
Wow.
were just a fledgling group. They hadn't really been known yet. Danny Bell, the
Oh man.
Archers, before the Archers even became the Archers in that way, their brother Gary, who was older, had a
Yeah.
sort of a church group, you know, and
Oh yeah, I just had Steve Archer on the show.
oh, that's great.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Well, he
One of
was
my
a
heroes.
kid. Yeah, he was a kid when we were doing
Oh
all
wow.
this. And in fact, Gary Archer was the guy who put together a record for us to put out, you know, our first single. And we sold it at one of these uh, Assemblies of God Christ Ambassador conventions
Yeah, I remember
in
those.
Fresno. And there was like, we went up and played for like thousands of people. We were called upon to do the theme song. It was called The Now Life, you know. And so we get up there and do it. And the guest speaker was Jimmy Swaggart, of all people, right?
Wow.
So we get up and play the song, and it's a raucous, pumping tune. You know, this is the now life. You know, we're up there. We walk off stage, and I'm underneath the, you know, in the dressing room, and someone screams, "You got to get out there and take a curtain call." They're all stamping and shouting. They're on their feet, right? This entire audience gave us a standing ovation. And we're up there, and I could see Jimmy Swaggart off to the side just seething because when this was all over, he had to get up and preach against what his entire
Oh,
audience had just done a
whoops.
standing O for.
Wow.
And of course, my parents didn't want me to be part of any of this because these guys were older. They were all in college,
Yeah.
you know, and they had these radical political views. You know how the late 60s
Hmm.
was. So I'd come home spouting all of this sort of rhetoric, and they said, we've got to get our kid out of this band. We're losing him, you know. So we came up here to Sacramento and played this big sort of river raft thing, and with a bunch of these CCM artists that were soon to be big stars. And my dad invited a pastor friend of his to come and sort of judge whether this was worthwhile for me to be doing or not. And when it was all over, he said, "You know, Mike," he said, "that was really great entertainment, but you'll never be able to preach the gospel with this music. It just ain't going to happen." And of course, I went home totally dejected. I had to quit the group. And that was kind of a turning point for me because at that point I thought, well, if I can't serve God with this music, which is what I wanted to do, I'm just going to go the other direction. So
Yeah.
I spent several years veering off the path, as most or many young Christian men do. There wasn't really any role models for me in music at that time, other than maybe Larry Norman and maybe Randy Stonehill. But because they were coming from Southern California,
Uh-huh.
it was harder to connect with them. They were older than I,
Yeah.
and I saw that happening. Then I heard Phil Keaggy, and I thought, now that's something I can get into because he was a great guitar player.
Yeah. Well, there
And
wasn't, unless an artist kind of came your way where you were back in those days, or you went into a record store and just tried out a bunch of albums,
mhm,
you really didn't know like, who to stand, whose shoulders to stand on. You just kind of had to experiment until you found someone. It wasn't like later on, 10, 15 years later when there's Christian radio and you can sample everything that Christian music is trying to throw out there. I mean, that's the kind of the era I grew up in was, I'm just starting my career until the late 80s, early 90s. Christian radio was firmly established at that point, but
sure,
you know, guys from that era, and just because you're a little bit older than me, that talking to people like Brian Duncan and Steve Archer and Brent Bourgeois, that were just like there wasn't a lot to draw from other than the people that were kind of in our area and that were touring out in California.
sure. Well, I mean, I can't say with all certainty whether if I had been a teenager 10, 15 years later, whether the world and the allure of sin would have been any less potent.
Yeah,
What I do know is that had there been groups like the one that I was in and others like it, I would have had less excuse to at least be doing music outside of that arena because, you know, I guess I ended up becoming the very thing that I needed when I was 16.
Hmm.
And I didn't design that. That was something God did. He called me to it. At the time when this was all starting to happen, I didn't really have any way to understand what it was going to be until decades later. And now I look back at it and I go, there it is. You know, now the kids that were watching you do this thing, hopefully they were inspired to take their faith more seriously, maybe take their music more seriously, or both. And so now I'm grateful for what happened. But at the time, you know, I didn't really know what it was going to be about.
Yeah. So when did you make that next step? So you kind of you come home and your dad's like, you can't, like this is not going to work. What
Yeah,
happened then?
well, you know, I guess I was around a junior in high school at the time. I finished high school, went to college, you know, majored in psychology. I thought I might end up being a therapist. I don't know, you know. But meanwhile, I was playing in rock and roll bands on the weekends to make money and to be in a band and play music, you know.
Yeah.
We did top 40 for a few years. And then I got out of that. And shortly after that is when I formed that band I was telling you earlier about with the guys singing, you know,
Uh-huh.
really got into vocals, harmony. Uh, we would do things like take a song. There's a song by the group Genesis before they sort of went real commercial, and it's called Entangled. I think it's on the
Mm-hmm.
Trick of the Tail album.
Yep. I know that song.
Very, very detailed and delicate. And there's three-part harmony in the chorus where Phil Collins harmonizes with himself. We took that thing apart and I learned every little thing. Our big thing was to copy the record exactly and get every guitar part perfect. And we would go inside these little clubs, you know, and people were used to hearing hits, and we would all of a sudden launch into that, and the whole room would fall under a spell. And
Huh.
it was like, man, this is what I want to do. This kind of singing, this kind of playing. It was very inspiring to me, and their voices, we all sound like brothers. You know, when you have a family blend, like the
Yeah.
Beach Boys and other
Yep.
families, where
Mm-hmm.
it's just this perfect blend. And it was so seductive and so amazing. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, you're really not going in the right direction, you know, with your life. And how are you going to go into music seriously, big time, and have God be either completely absent or just a footnote, or, you know, you're haunted by Christ, but he's not at the center. And I ended up making a phone call to one of the guys that was in that band back when I was 15. And he was a real serious Christian, very devoted, almost like a missionary type guy, you know, where his whole life was about Jesus and nothing else. And I knew it was a risk making that phone call because I knew he was going to challenge me, and that's exactly what he did. And after that conversation, I started getting this really intense feeling that I didn't understand, and it was building in me, and God was really dealing with me in a way that was very personal, very sort of intense. And all of this led to a kind of sort of Old Testament biblical encounter with the living God. You know, I wasn't up on a mountain, I was on a train bridge, but I went out there and this thing happened that I can't even describe. I can only tell you that it was so profound and so powerful, and I was terrified. I didn't know quite what to do. And then the words were spoken, you need to go to Sacramento to this church up there called Warehouse Ministries, which I'd known about. That pastor had started this church. The guy who told me you'll never be able to use rock and roll for the
No way.
gospel.
Wow.
His wife started, he was a missionary too. His
Yeah.
wife started a Bible study while he was on the road preaching in Africa and all these places. And it grew and it grew and it grew until it got to a point where he came home from one of his crusades and she says, you need to give this road life up and come and minister to these kids because we can't fit them anymore. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. So he started this church in a warehouse, you know, sort of a tilt up building.
Yeah. Yeah.
They started having concerts every Saturday night of contemporary Christian artists, all the big names. And I mean, all of them. If you went down the list of everyone who was on Maranatha, you know, and later Benson and all the labels, all those groups and artists came through. So that's where God called me to go. And I couldn't, I didn't really know what was going on up there. I kind of had a vague idea.
So
But
were
when I
you asked to come up? Were you come asked up to work or just be a part of the church? Like, how did you
just
support
go,
yourself?
just go there.
Yeah.
There's nothing specific about, except that there was a specific ministry, a thing
Yeah.
waiting for me there. And I didn't want to go because I was perfectly happy in San Jose with my family and my friends and my band and all the accolades and fun I was having. But without going into too much of it, because it's a long, long story, I did eventually end up there.
Hmm.
They put me to work producing a radio program that they had called Rock and Religion. And I don't know if you remember it, but it was on over 350 stations all over the country and around the world,
Yeah.
including major rock stations like WNEW in New York. This thing was a big hit because it took the place of the old time gospel hour and things like that. Our radio used
Yeah.
to have to run religious programming because
Right. That's right.
so I got in the middle of that and we started, I learned how to do radio production. I eventually became the announcer. I became the producer. And then we went off to another sort of direction where we started interviewing secular artists. And what we were looking for was the spiritual influences on rock music, getting them to talk about it
Hmm.
without being overt, like we had to sort of make it look like we were doing just an average rock radio interview with them.
Right.
But subtly, we would turn the conversation towards the spiritual realm, not talking about Jesus, just getting them to sort of admit that maybe some of what they were doing was having an effect beyond just entertainment, that it
Hmm.
was having a spiritual impact, getting them to talk about their personal beliefs, their religions, if they had any. And we ended up having Pete Townsend of The Who. We had Kerry Livgren on there right
Wow.
after he became a Christian. We
Yeah.
interviewed the Grateful Dead, The Doors, after Jim
Golly.
Morrison was gone. Oh my gosh, it was an unbelievable experience.
And
And
how receptive were they to talking about spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual things?
um,
Like for the most part,
if
was
we
everybody in?
if we framed the conversation correctly, they were more than willing to talk about it.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone ever, because of our interviewer, Mary, the woman, she was the wife of that pastor. She had a way of being able to draw them into the conversation without
Uh-huh.
really knowing what it is we were going after.
Wow.
And it was subtle, but it was very effective. And this was all going great until the FCC did what they call deregulation, which means that now these stations could sell commercial time and not have to run religious programming anymore. So when that happened, that was the death knell for the show because we lost half of our stations literally
Wow.
overnight.
Wow.
And so, rather than sit around and wallow in that um, disappointment, we built a recording studio at the church. And it wasn't long before Charlie Peacock showed up.
Hmm.
He'd been living in the area, and
Yeah.
he found out about this church. He had just recently sort of renewed his faith in Christ. And he started coming around, and before you know it, there he was in the studio with us. We put him to work as a producer, and we did our first album there with Stephen Souls, who was in the Alpha Band. I don't know if you remember those guys, but
I don't.
he toured with Bob Dylan, with T-Bone Burnett, David Mansfield, and
Oh
himself.
gosh.
And so he was the first producer that we used. And
Uh-huh.
the studio started attracting big names, people that were Christians that heard about this, wanted to come and record there or be part of it. So for 10 years, we had quite a scene. And that's where Charlie did his first album, Lie Down in the Grass,
Okay.
played guitar on there with Jimmy A.
Yeah.
Brent Bourgeois started hanging around too
Uh-huh.
because he had his band Bourgeois Tag and we were all friends.
Right.
It wasn't long before Brent got involved and it just turned into this really beautiful thing. So out of that, the 77's emerged and we got our first, we formed a little record label and we wanted it to be a secular label, but we couldn't really pull that off yet. So we went to Word Records and they gave us our own label, our own little sort of thing called Exit Records.
Yeah. So what was the, I mean, if you go back and Sticks and Stones was the first record, right?
No, that was the
Correct?
fourth.
Oh, okay.
We've done 3 albums before that.
Okay. So, but still, that the type of music that you guys were doing, um, what was what was the what am I trying to say here? What was the audience for that? I mean, how, like, was it fringe stuff at that point, or was there really an audience for where you guys were taking your music?
Well, when we first started, our audiences were the local high schools. We would set up
Yeah.
at lunchtime in the quad and play for unsuspecting teenagers.
Yeah.
And in 1979 and 80, it was
Because
punk.
if you're good, I mean, if you're good at what you're doing,
Well, it was
you know,
punk rock, it was new wave.
yeah,
And so all of my stuff that I brought in with all that pop vocalizing it was just gone. And I had to turn the guitar up, unlearn everything I learned, and play with just full on brash abandon, downstroking 3 chords at a time and yelling over it, right?
yeah,
Uh, it was it was a lot of fun, but it was sort of difficult to come off of that sort of highly skilled 70s rock and pop and go into this thing where it's almost like you're starting over like a beginner.
huh.
So we just poured every ounce of energy that we could muster into our performances, and we got known as a band that took no prisoners. We were very intense. The first album is kind of all over the place. There's a little bit of Tom Petty, Elvis Costello, a little bit of Deep Purple, hard rock, Zeppelin. We just threw in the kitchen sink.
Yeah.
Everything we could think of, we did, and it turned into almost like a workshop, which is what our band has always been. It's like it's us sort of having fun experimenting because we never were taken seriously by any of the labels we were on, so we were free to do whatever we wanted.
So what year would that have been? Like, what's the
Well,
time frame of that?
the first album came out in 1982.
Okay.
Word distributed that. And then it wasn't long before Amy Grant had her big success
Mm-hmm.
on Word. And that's when they combined forces with A&M Records to have a sort of a secular distribution for Word
Yeah, I
Records.
remember all that.
And so our little label got put into that, and we thought this is great. Now, we hired a private or a private like promoter, a kid, who was a
Uh-huh.
radio promoter. He got our second album all the way up to #1 on all the college charts, all up and down the East Coast. So we could have gone back there and toured and had a big hit. But the problem is the record wasn't available in any of the stores where they were hearing the music. You
Oh
know,
man.
it was in Christian bookstores, with those elderly women,
Yeah.
the gatekeepers we used to
Yeah.
call them. And they would
Yeah.
have they would hide the record underneath the counter because there was a photograph of me laying on the ground, kind of like Iggy Pop,
Yeah.
doing some sort of terrible thing. I used to have this sort of epileptic seizure routine I used to do. I would flop around like a fish and then just go dormant.
Yeah.
And it looked like I died right there on stage. Um, that was the album cover. And there were some lyrics that were a little bit questionable. Word got around that the lyrics were obscene. So before you know, we were the band that kids were buying this record and hiding it under the bed from their
Oh
Christian.
my gosh. So I had people in my family that you're describing right now.
Mhm.
Was that if it was a little bit questionable, a little bit too much on the edge, they weren't allowed to listen to it because Christian music was supposed to be this safe space
Right.
where, that didn't get too rowdy, didn't ask any questions, right?
Mhm.
Didn't travel too far outside of the church walls where they went to church every
Right.
week. And yeah, I mean, I can totally see how that would be something that would happen with your music.
Well, at the time, we were devastated because we wanted the success. We wanted to be on the cover of CCM.
Yeah.
We wanted to get the interviews and everything. And
Did that ever make you want to compromise though? Did it make you want to go, hey, let's tone back
yeah,
the
we
next
would have
record?
played ball. We would have played ball. We would have done anything to be successful. The labels wouldn't let us. They told us, "You can't be that. You'll never be that." In fact, wasn't John Still the guy who ran CCM?
CCM, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I had a conversation with him. I said, "You put everyone else on the cover. Why won't you put us on the cover?" He just laughed in my face. He says, "You'll never be on the cover of CCM. I will never do it." And I go, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "We need that." He says, "No, you don't." He said, That's the last thing you need. And you need to be who you are because it's
Interesting.
and once I got some hindsight, I got away from this. I realized that, being hid under the bed by those kids, that was the best thing that could happen to us because that created a fan base that was so loyal that here we are to this day, going on, it's over almost 45 years ago. Those same kids that bought those records are still buying our records today
Wow.
because of what we meant to them at the time. I've had more than one person come up to me and say, "You saved me from Amy Grant." And I said, "Well, we didn't get into
We
this."
saved you from For Him.
No, but uh, I never got into this thing to save anyone from Amy Grant. I wanted to see them saved from sin.
Yeah.
But really, what they were saying is, I was allowed to be myself when I
Mm.
saw what we were doing. I fit in all of a sudden because a lot of kids, even let's face it, when you grow up in church, or even if you start getting dragged to church as a teenager, fitting in is what it's all about. And if you don't feel like you fit in to a church environment, you are going to leave that environment.
Well, it's bands like you that set the stage for. I mean, let's DC Talk, for Jars of Clay, for Caedmon's Call, for artists that weren't following the normal,
Right.
what was played on AC radio, to be able to have an audience that was outside of the peripheral of what was selling, but to find an audience because it was good. And that's the thing. If it's good, people will find it. If it's exceptional, people will continue to buy it, right? And that's that's what that's what I go back to your music, as I listen to it again after all these years and go, it's just like I would listen to this right now. I mean, it's that good, because I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up on, I hear influences in the music of the first band that came to mind was Psychedelic Furs, which I'm a
Hmm.
big fan of. The Cure. There were all these bands that were just left of center, even in pop music
Sure.
in the 80s, that were
You
like,
like the
that's
Smiths?
just, oh, the Smiths. Yeah. Heck yeah. Yeah.
Well, all those guys in the band you mentioned, like DC Talk, all of them have come to me and thanked me and told me they were huge fans and that it
Mm.
inspired them to do what they do. So sometimes, you have to be the guy with the scythe, the sickle. You have to be the
Yeah.
one to blaze a trail.
Yeah.
So yes, we didn't have the success, but what we did do is got a lot of people to form bands and have the success, which is perfectly fine with me now that I'm old and wretched. I don't even care anymore. There was a time where all that stuff meant so much. And when you
Yeah.
get older, you realize that none of that stuff really matters. What really matters is, were you true to your calling and to yourself, the person God made you to be? And that was our number one message in the end.
Tell me how the 77's got started. So you met the guys where you sang the harmonies, and and
Well,
you started, you've got your studio now in in Sacramento, and
when
you're
I
starting to
first
make
got to
music.
Yeah, when I first got to Sacramento, when I obeyed the call and went up there, the very first thing that happened to me before the radio show or any of that stuff was they said, "We're having these CCM concerts every weekend. We need a band to go out to the schools locally and represent what it is we're trying to do. You know, would you like to be in such a group?" And I said, "My only caveat is it's got to be good. I'm not going to be in a crap band." Okay. And they said, "No, we wouldn't do it if it was bad." So they asked me, they asked Jimmy Abeg, Jan Eric Voles, and Mark Tootle and Mark Proctor. And we scratched it, threw it together from scratch and called ourselves the Scratch Band. Uh, and that's when we started playing those lunchtimes. That was in the fall of 1979. So the record on Word didn't come out until 1982.
Yeah.
So we spent 3 or 4 years just slogging those high schools. We played youth authorities. We played Lompoc Federal Prison. We played churches. We played bars. Uh, any place where we could get a crowd. We went up to San Francisco and played at the Mabuhay Gardens, which was the premier punk club. And that was quite an experience.
And were you able to make a living during this time doing all that? Was
I
that
was working for the church
okay?
at the time, producing the radio show. So we all had jobs at the church while we were doing the band.
And then how was your message being received? Like, especially going to some of these punk clubs and going to some of these places that weren't schools. How was it that your message was received? Were you welcomed into those, with all those other bands and those promoters and the people that were coming?
Well, we did our set and people either liked it or they didn't. They either paid attention or they didn't. Our best audiences, oddly enough, were California youth authorities,
Huh.
where we had a captive audience,
Yeah.
you know, and we'd go up there and they would just lose their minds because we were rocking harder than probably anything else they'd seen. Um, we did okay. Yeah, some places we did better than others.
Yeah.
Say that for the most part, we were rocking so hard that you couldn't deny the passion and commitment. We even went as far as to quote Bible verses in between songs in some of the rowdier clubs, which was probably not the smartest thing to do. But we were young. We did what we thought we were supposed to do, and
Sure.
it had its impact or not.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Uh,
Yes.
It went over. Yeah, I'd say it went over. And we got better as a band. By the time we put our second album out on Word with A&M distribution, I would say we were ready for the big time. At that point, when that record was climbing up the charts on college radio, we could have gone out on any major tour and done very, very well. The band just got better and better and better through the 80s.
And then what did you do touring wise? What was your touring life like once that
Um,
second record came out?
Mainly regional and West Coast. We went and played the Cornerstone Festival. We played some
Mhm.
of the other Christian festivals. Uh, we didn't tour as much as I toured with Charlie Peacock because he managed to score some more secular booking agency like FBI and people like that. We eventually hooked up with the Bill Graham organization in San Francisco. Bill was still booking the Fillmore and places like that. And he became very interested in our little label and wanted to manage it. So we started getting more and more secular interest and eventually wound up with a distribution deal with Island Records.
Oh, wow.
Um, in fact, our album came out 1 week before the Joshua Tree. And unfortunately, Island was just a little boutique label owned by Chris Blackwell. It was distributed by Atlantic, Warner's, Atco, and U2 had the success because all of those branches were able to get behind them with their machinery, the press, all of that, because their success was so big, Little Island couldn't really handle it. So they
Yeah.
had to draw on the larger corporation to even service it. And I've gone on record to say that have the Joshua Tree come out on CBS or Warner's properly, they probably would have sold 2 to 3 times as many.
Mm.
But they were loyal to Chris and to Island Records. Our little record came out and sank like a stone. I mean, the entire staff of Island left the office. There was only 30 people working in the office there in Manhattan. And when U2 came on the road with Joshua Tree, they just all left to go hang out with them and try to support them because it took every bit of machinery to hold that kind of success
Yeah,
together.
sure. Uh-huh.
So us being on Island for 5 minutes did us no good because you couldn't find our record either in the secular stores or the Christian bookstores. And we had this wonderful album on Island Records that none of our fans could find. So it ended up being a bust. And the same thing happened to Charlie Peacock and the other artists on our label. Um, so it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. We got reviewed in Rolling Stone. We got a great review. We had reviews and interviews with Interview Magazine, that big Andy Warhol oversized magazine that used to come out. A lot of secular press, but we ended up playing because we were working with Bill Graham. We played the Fillmore. We could go into any club being Island recording artists and headline the club anywhere we wanted to. We would just call the club and say, Island recording artists coming through, and they would just give us a headlining spot right on the, they wanted to be in on the success if we were going to break,
Yeah.
but it
It,
just didn't happen.
and what does that do to you at that point when you make the record you want to make? It's a great record. And I mean, For Him's been there at this juncture too, where you just go, what do we have to do? Like, what? Why is this not working the way we thought it was going to work? Like, what do you do at that point? What was the band's mentality? Were you just like full steam ahead, or do we go back and try and refigure what our our roadmap is?
I think it demoralized us to the point where the first 77's group ended up splintering
Hmm.
because Jan, our bass player, ended up managing Charlie Peacock. So Charlie decided to move to Nashville and sign with Sparrow.
Hmm.
They sort of rolled out the red carpet for him. Once he did that, it wasn't long before Jim Abeg moved out there. Then Jan Voles moved out there and left our group. Aaron Smith, our drummer, ended up moving out there as well. So I had to start over in the ashes of this thing.
Was there any like draw for you to go to Nashville? You just felt like you're going to
Yes.
stand your
In
ground
fact,
there? Was it?
Charlie Peacock offered me a lucrative solo deal with the label he was starting with Sparrow.
Yeah.
And I looked it over and I said, man, the money's great. Charlie's really into this, but
Because it would have
um,
worked. I mean, in hindsight, I look back and I mean, I don't, look, um, I don't want to, yeah, I don't know. I'll edit this out here. Yeah, just listening to your voice, I'm just like, of course that would have worked. I mean, just listening what you're able to do vocally, nobody else in Christian music could do that. I mean, you
I
were you
think
were you were in a unique place.
if I had made that move at the time, I'm certain that I would have found my place in Nashville in possibly both industries. I even sat with Billy Ray Hearn and Mike Blanton, all those guys, looked them right in the face. They were ready to play ball. But my wife and I just had our baby daughter.
Oh,
I didn't want to raise my daughter away from her grandparents, her cousins, her aunts, uncles. I didn't want to drag my family to Nashville on the hope that all of it would just work out for me.
right.
I also had a deep commitment to the new 77s that I was rebuilding with new guys, with Mark Harmon and Dave Linhart and Aaron Smith temporarily. Eventually, we got
Hmm.
Bruce Spencer. Um, I felt like we had a lot more to say, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to say it if I moved. And Charlie didn't take the 77 seriously at that point. He kind of said, why drag it out for a few more albums? Let's just, let it go at a high point, come out here and I'll make this thing happen for you. And I just felt in my spirit that it wasn't the right thing to do. And I have absolutely no regrets now.
Yeah.
Had it would have been the right move for me professionally,
Yeah.
but personally and musically, I am very happy with having stayed behind because of not only the music we made, but the impact that we continue to have in the wake of our initial sort of blast.
Well,
What happened?
there's something, I hate to interrupt here, but there's something about moving to Nashville, and I say this with all respect to my friends that live there and have great careers there, that it feels like you go there to play the game, if
Mhm.
that makes sense. Like you kind of give yourself over to go, okay, well, I'm just going to get in that meat grinder there, and because that's where you got to go if you want a better chance of success. And I never lived in Nashville. I always felt we lived down in the South, Mobile, Alabama for a little while, Orlando for a little while. I've been in Tulsa the last almost 20 years now. And I've never felt like I had to be in Nashville because there's something about, you don't get, you kind of can do things your own way,
Mhm.
and you don't get drawn into that. I don't know. I say it's a meat grinder. That's probably not the best way to say it. Maybe the way the sausage is put together, you can
Mhm.
kind of stay away from that a little bit and come up with something that maybe is a little bit more your own.
Well, again, this would have happened 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Nashville has changed somewhat now with the advent of guys like Jack White coming into there and building a cottage industry around himself and other people like that. I would say that there might be now maybe more room for guys like me to
Sure.
flourish versus the early 90s when things were still very different. And I never felt like I fit into the Nashville thing. I've got more friends there than I do here. And when I go out there, I can get a lot of work done. I've done tours in and out of there. I've done sessions there. I've done a lot of stuff that I would have been doing had I moved. But I also look at some of my peers and other friends that moved out there, and not all of them accomplished that much more than I did. In fact, some of them far less. It really depends on who you hook up with,
Yeah.
what your circle of influence is with your friends, and whether you're in the touring club or whether you're in the studio scene, whether you're in the writers. I probably would have dabbled in all of it and gotten by pretty well.
Yeah.
Uh, I would hope that I would have, but who's to say? My life could have crashed and burned out there instead of crashed and burned out here. Uh, I made a lot of mistakes. I went down some dark roads here, but God has been faithful to me
Hmm.
and brought me back every time. And things are solid now. It took me a lot of years to learn some hard lessons, but again, I have no regrets because my daughter got to grow up with her family. I got to do some of the best music I think I ever did. I look at that early 80s stuff as sort of the seminal beginning of it, but the stuff that I'm proud of, that I really relate to, is all the stuff I've made since that time. So, and it's continued to have that same kind of impact on, now that we don't have teenage kids anymore as our audience. Our audience has grown up with us. Most of them are grandparents.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how a lot of them have lost their faith over the years, or it's either watered down to where it's almost meaningless, or they become atheists. Some of them have become, oh gosh, it's all over the map. The one thing that remains constant is that they are still rabid fans of ours, which means that we continue to have a lyrical, spiritual influence upon
Yeah.
all of them, in spite of whatever direction they've gone in. And that brings me a lot of joy, because I feel like there's not too many artists that are known as Christians, and people know that you are. We've tried to hide it, and it always went before us and followed after us.
Yeah.
And what that showed me is that, God prepares that path for you. If
Hmm.
that's what he's called you to do, you don't have to say or do a whole lot of anything. All I wanted to do is do excellent work, which is something you brought up, is that have a high standard for your art, a high standard. We were learning how to make good records, great records, write great songs. Um, they didn't have to be about Jesus, but inevitably people knew that it was, in spite of, I could write about anything.
Yeah. And that's what to me is worth. You get 20, 30 years down the road and you can look back and be so proud of what you did back then, and and listen to it without regret, because you didn't compromise and you did the music that you knew you wanted to do. And I think, man, I think music is a real gift from God. I think it's programmed in all of us, because music speaks to us more than I think anything else in creation. There's something about music that unites us all together. And, you talk about people who were fans of your music, maybe that have lost their way or moved on to different beliefs in their life, but we can all come back to these songs. We can all come back to these moments. I mean, I'm not a Taylor Swift fan, but I've had some friends that have gone to the shows, and they're just like, it's amazing to see 30,000 people in one place that know every word to every song, are completely bought in to what she's doing. And it's a uniting of all these different people of age groups and walks of life. That's what our music has done too. We feel it too as our band, is that as our audience has gotten older, they're continuing to go back and wherever they are in life and hear those songs again. And probably the same as you do, we get messages from those people on social media that say, it's been a really tough 10 years of my life, but I went
Mm.
back and listened to, your Walk On album, and I was reminded of, who God is and what he means to me, and that journey in my life. And just thank you again for that music. So, I'm sure you're getting those messages as well from fans that are just like, I'm just so glad that I was introduced to that music when I was 16, when I was 18, when I was 22.
Yes, that started early on. I was the guy who ended up answering all the fan mail, and we got it in buckets in the
Wow.
80s. And I
Yeah.
answered every single one personally. And that's one thing I miss about that era, is that personal response thing, that that we did, that's the thing that cemented that fandom for life, because the person not only got an autograph or just some signature, they got someone who was right there, for them, being personal, answering their questions. I remember I used to get letters like that when I'd write to record companies when I was a
Yeah.
kid. I was the kid that would write all these letters complaining about stuff, and anytime I got a letter, personal letter back from Warner Brothers or any of those labels, I would frame it or something, because it was like, yeah, man, they really care.
Yeah, they really heard me. They
They heard
actually
me.
took part of their life and responded to me personally.
Yes.
They actually read my name and
Mhm.
and read what I had to say. That's incredible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is not a day goes by where I don't get a message on Facebook or somewhere from someone saying the very things you just said, and I know you get a lot of that yourself.
And
It's humbling.
it really is. It really is. And people keep that stuff, right? Every letter, I guarantee you, every letter that you sent back, somebody has that still somewhere.
Oh, I've
And it,
signed some of them multiple
yeah.
times. I posed for the photographs.
Yeah. That's crazy. Yeah, it's so tell me what you're doing now. I mean, I kind of watch what you're doing online. It seems like the band's still doing some things here and there, and like tell me what is the future? What's the present? What's the future of Michael Rowe and the 77's?
Well, I've toured a lot over the last 20 years to make a living. I We formed a group called the Lost Dogs. I don't know if you're familiar with that
Uh-huh.
group.
Oh yeah.
Terry Taylor and Derry Doherty. Gene Eugene was in it, and then when he passed, Steve Hindalong
Mm-hmm.
got in there.
Yeah.
We've done several albums. We toured a lot. I toured with Derry as a duo called Kerosene Halo, which I really loved. Uh, 77's continued to play and tour up till about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. We slowed down, and when COVID hit, our drummer Bruce Spencer called me up in a panic. He just goes, "Dude, we've got to get online. We've got to get on YouTube and start playing live and taking tips, because I'm gonna sink. I'm gonna go under." And I'm going, "Oh my gosh!" I've always been notoriously camera shy unless I was doing something really stupid.
Yeah, I feel the
Yep.
same way.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? I don't want to
Uh-huh.
be on camera, and I went, "No, no, this is my worst nightmare." But out we went. We bought all these cameras. We got professional lighting. We set up a studio in his living room. He's got a recording studio, adjacent to it. And we said, all right, we have to have the same kind of quality that 77s are known for here. Because if we're going to do this, it has to look better and sound better than everybody else. Because you remember during that time, everyone was sitting behind a mic with a
Yep.
guitar or a keyboard,
Yeah.
begging for money. I mean, we all freaked out. I'm sure you did. Everybody freaked out. It was like, there
I was
goes.
working for churches at the time. I'm working
Mhm.
for churches that are trying to figure out how do we keep our congregation from, you
Believe
know,
me,
to
it was
completely disappearing. Yeah.
it was unbelievable, and no one saw it coming. And it was like
Mhm.
out of nowhere, we're all thrust into this really weird situation. So I thought, okay, I'll give it a go. All right, so we got a friend of ours named Chris Harrelson to produce, run cameras, do sound, do lighting, do all this stuff. And the three of us just started, and we started live, which was a big mistake. We were doing it simulcast to Facebook Live and YouTube. And as you know, anytime you marry pro audio with pro video, unless you've got a crew that really has this thing together, everything is going to go wrong, and everything did.
Oh
But
man.
people loved the show. They started sending us hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and I'm going, "This is amazing! Now I like being on camera." So uh, after several weeks, we bottomed out all of our own songs. We have, between myself and the Lost Dogs and all the other groups I'm in, we eventually played all those songs, and then we started doing cover songs. And now I'm back in the 70s again with my guys doing those vocals again and all that. It's like
Oh man.
we ended up doing 120 shows nonstop every week. And of course, there's fans out there that tabulate and keep track of all the songs, how many times we played them. By the end of the run, now we're doing reruns. It's in syndication while we're doing a new record. But we ended up playing almost 1,000 unique songs. In other words, without repeating. We did repeat some, But imagine learning 1,000 songs within 3 years and playing them all live on the spot without any rehearsal. And that was another thing. No rehearsal. We did it like
Wow.
Dean Martin. We did it once. I mean,
Wow.
we'd run it down. If there were some complicated changes, we'd frantically run it down like minutes before we did the show. But as far as having a rehearsal, it never happened. Uh, I'm telling you what, I'm exhausted just talking about it. But I will say the fans have been there for us, man. They've been sending in the money. That got us through financially.
Mm. Wow.
And it's not like anything else I've ever done. I mean, I've never done anything with that much dedication and that much time commitment ever. So that was quite a learning experience.
Wow. And so
We
what's the
might do
future?
it again.
Yeah, what's the future for you guys? What's the future for you?
We're doing a new 77's album, first one of new material in over 20 years.
Oh man.
We've been recording basics for the last 10 years and just for various reasons just never finished anything. So finally we said enough's enough. The fans are just pissed all the time. Like, when you guys are going to put out some new music? And so I said, all right, fine. So uh, we've got about 3 albums, 7 songs each. So it's going to be seven, then seven. Then I guess we'll put the S and we'll call it 777. So there's like 21 songs that we're working on right now. And again, as always, the music is all over the map. Everything from rock to pop to you name it. There isn't any one style, but it's going to be good. That I will tell you. That's the one goal we have, is that great songwriting, great vocals, great guitar playing, great rhythm section. I hope the fans like it. They probably will complain. The rock guys are going to want more rock. The people that like other stuff are going to want something else. But we just do what we do.
That's great. Anything else you want to talk about? I think that's a really good run of conversation there.
We could talk all day, Andy, but it's been great. I'm really glad that you had me on this thing. It's nice to be able to do something like this with someone like you. And I can't believe that I only just heard that thing you did with Brent and John Anderson.
It is, it's amazing. As well as that thing did on the radio, there are people that they know, they have a good understanding of Christian music, have never heard it. And
it's possible I heard it. Now, when did it come out?
90, 99, 2000, maybe,
Okay, so
maybe
it's been
2000.
over 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that I might have heard it in passing and just overlooked it. I put that thing on, and first of all, the song is gorgeous. The track,
Oh,
the
yeah.
way that loping sort of rhythm, and how those
It's all Brent,
lines,
man.
yeah, the loping lines underneath,
Mm-hmm.
and then and your voice, it's like, oh my gosh, it's like these vocals are killing me. And then when Anderson comes on, I just went, oh my God. It's like, well, first of all, it's tapping into something that, I went and saw Yes back in the early 70s. I saw the Close to the Edge tour. I saw the Topographic Oceans tour.
Wow.
And particularly that Topographic Oceans thing, because it was a very spiritual record, I had as close to a religious experience as I think anyone could have at a rock concert when I saw that. I mean, I was convinced that someone dosed me with LSD, even though they did not. And the girl I was with, she didn't know anything about Yes. And she was so gobsmacked, she couldn't speak. I mean, she was just sitting there. I was watching her. It was like watching someone in an old time Pentecostal church revival. We were transported out of our bodies. And when the show was over, I tried to say, gee, wasn't that great? What did you think? She said, don't talk to me. Don't.
Wow.
She wouldn't permit me to talk to her all the way home because the experience was so powerful.
That's you go to, me growing up in church and, worship kind of being a big part of my whole story, and then getting into Christian music and, just kind of living my life in that realm. I didn't really start going to secular shows until like right after I was married in the early 90s. Like, I never went to a secular concert just because it was kind of frowned upon. And I listened to the radio and I was a fan of all that stuff. Like, I'm a 70s and 80s music nerd. Like, I know so much of that stuff. but just never felt comfortable going to the concerts because of the religious home that I grew up in.
Mhm.
But when I got married, my wife and I started going to shows. I was astounded at the worship that was happening. It's
Mhm.
the same thing. It's hands are up, people are singing, moving around. I'm like, this is worship. What is this? And it took me a long time to realize that, man, music in it and of itself is a gift from God. And you
Yes.
mentioned it earlier about bringing these artists into your radio show, these secular artists and rock artists that you would go down a spiritual path and they'd be open to talking about it if you introduced it the right way. Because I believe that if you spend any time with music, you understand there's a spiritual element to it. And all of us are just trying to figure out what that is. Those
Sure.
of us that have found Christ, we understand and we can go down that path of going, okay, this is what music is created for. But those that haven't found Christ they're feeling it. They know it's there. They know it's a gift from somewhere else. It's mystical to them.
Mhm.
And some of them can just push it so far that I think it transcends the boundaries you know, of just this earthly suit that we're in, and you feel something else. And so
Sure.
bands like Yes, guys like John Anderson are super spiritual, because they've chased this thing down so far and understand that this is something well beyond what we could ever comprehend. And then it transfers to us, and
Yeah.
we have spiritual experiences, even when it's not, Christian music per se. And I just think that's why, man, there's such a brotherhood to me of guys that even though we didn't cross paths and we weren't playing the same festivals and tours, we can share a lot of the same memories and stories because of what music did to transform us and our journeys, and how we're never going to give this up. I mean, this is life to us, music, and
Yes.
creating music and finding that next thing to do with music, and where can it go now? Because if God is endless and music comes from God, then music must be endless in my logic. So let's keep chasing it. Let's keep running down the idea.
That was the main motivation for me to return to my faith when I had walked away from it, because I knew that once I was face to face with God, the last thing I would ever want to miss out on was the music that would be in his presence.
Hmm.
I just thought, if it's this good here, it was a way for God to show me a part of what he was about. And it's sort of a language above speech. It bypasses the intellect and goes right to your heart. And this is why I was disappointed when I heard that you guys had a little trouble with John Anderson on your record with some Christian radio people. And I thought, it's really sad that they would miss the point of the fact that that gift, like you say, and the sound of his voice alone, there's something in it that God is present, regardless of what he believes or where
Yeah,
he's at.
that's
You
right.
know, God can bless his voice often far greater than some guy who's pretending to be a Christian in Christian music and living, an extremely ungodly life. And we won't mention names. We've all, I've been that guy, and I know some of those guys. And God's, it's a journey, and we're all on this journey, and hopefully God brings us all back to himself by the end of it. um anyway, I'm just glad you guys did it. I'm glad Brent had the idea and it all worked out. And but anyway, just listening to all your music, man, the vocals are just spot on. It's like
Oh,
it
thank
makes
you.
me think of what I would have done had I stuck with my original direction. And in fact, there's some things I heard that are not unlike some of the things we're doing now.
Yeah.
So I just think, well, it is coming back. Of course, I've gotten away from punk music and all that. That was just a stepping
It,
stone. But
it's too hard. It's too hard on the body at this point to try and get
I
back into that.
have a feeling that your music and ours is going to converge a lot more in the future.
uh, we always meet in the middle, don't we? As far as
Absolutely.
we all meet in the middle.